We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report on the phone. It's my pleasure to welcome to the program Jamal Abdi. He is the president of the National Iranian American Council. Jamal, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Let's just, I imagine by now that people are familiar with the two most, I guess, prominent men who were assassinated by the U.S., killed in a drone strike. But tell us something about Soleimani and Abdul Mahdi al-Mundis.
Well, I think the real implications of this strike, lie with the Soleimani assassination. Mohandas having a role, as an official with the PMF is significant because this seems to be yet another violation of Iraqi sovereignty and a sign that the United States is doubling down on the strikes that took place, which triggered the demonstration and attack on the embassy and triggered backlash among the Iraqi parliament and government. With Soleimani, though, this is a world historic event. I think. This is the most influential general inside of Iran, and really potentially, the second most powerful man inside of the country. He was responsible for Iran's posture in the region and coordinating these proxy and militia groups that Iran really relied on as part of its security strategy to fight this asymmetric battle against really the U.S. and its allies. And Soleimani actually, has a pretty mixed record inside of Iran among Iranians, but actually was according to polling, had a favorability of 80% among Iranians, making him the most popular public official inside of Iran. And I think that is because this is a hardliner, somebody who was very much part of Iran's repressive domestic apparatus, but he was viewed as somebody who really was a protector of Iran. He is viewed as the person who probably had the greatest role in defeating ISIS and from preventing Iran from becoming what a lot of the states neighboring Iran have become, these war zones and these failed states. And so a lot of Iranians, even if they had, negative views of the Iranian government and the regime and the hardliners and things like that, Soleimani still, I think, had a respect because of his ability to actually protect the territorial integrity of Iran and prevent these bad things from happening inside the country. In
the final analysis, and I've spoken to other people who've suggested that he had less, because he was less prominent in the domestic repression, that helped his favorability ratings. But I guess the bottom line is, if 80% of the people in Iran saw this guy favorably, and I've seen some, well-known reformers, members of parliament, tweet out condolences, to the extent that is heartfelt or not. The bottom line is that it creates the political pressure domestically in Iran, and maybe gives the opportunity for Iran to retaliate. I want to get there in a bit, but first, let me just ask you this, and I've asked this question of other people, and obviously there's no way for you to know for sure, but the reason why I bring up Mohandas is, and who is an Iraqi, and obviously it represents another intrusion upon Iraqi sovereignty, but Mohandas was more associated with the incursion into the U.S. embassy. And I wonder if, despite the fact that the U.S. essentially claimed credit for targeting Soleimani, if you think that this was a mistake in some way, or if this was like the intention, it was just a very weird way, even from the logic of the Trump administration, to the extent that there is any, it's a weird way of approaching this. Soleimani was not a household name in the United States. they're now talking about him like he was public enemy number one. And even on Fox News, I don't think that his name got mentioned more than, 2 times in the past year and a half or something. I mean, this is an odd way to go about this from the Trump administration perspective, unless from your perspective, it has a real operational difference on the ground.
I don't think it has an operational difference. I think the difference that this makes, though, and you may be right, and we're all kind of grasping at straws, trying to assign some logic to the way, I mean, in many cases, in the way that this administration behaves and operates, And, I mean, I wondered, and I still wonder, did Donald Trump move from a position where he was actually fairly conservative when it came to kinetic, the use of military force against Iran? He famously pulled back from bombing Iran with just 10 minutes to go because he realized it was disproportionate and it could trigger a Iranian retaliation that would lead to an all-out war. And so why did he suddenly cross the threshold and is now greenlighting this, highly disproportionate and this action that will very likely lead to Iranian retaliation? What has changed? I wondered if it was because the supreme leader of Iran actually tweeted and insulted Trump on Twitter and claimed that he couldn't do anything and kind of challenged his manhood if Trump felt like he needed to respond to that, and this was an ego move. I mean, you can't rule anything out.
Right.
But I will say, while I don't think Soleimani changes things operationally, I mean, supposedly he's this military genius and all these great things, but I'm sure that role can be replaced, to some level. But this does almost certainly put the U.S. and Iran on a path to conflict. It makes the prospect of the thing that groups like, Foundation for Defense of Democracies and people like, John Bolton, who, probably wishes he was back in the White House to be celebrating right now. But what they feared most was Donald Trump getting into the same room as Rouhani or Zarif and striking a deal with these guys. And I think that 2020 was viewed and is viewed by a lot of the folks who for the past 2 decades, even more than that, have wanted to go to war with Iran or who have wanted to at least destabilize and topple the regime in Iran. That 2020 was their last best hope to do that while they still had Donald Trump in the White House, falling for their traps. And this now, I don't see a pathway, at least for Donald Trump, to get to the table with Iran. That is just not going to happen. We are now on the course to war if we're not already there yet. And so my sense is that there was a lot of pressure on Donald Trump to take this action. There were incremental steps towards this. The U.S., after years of the Pentagon pushing back on the proposal to designate the Revolutionary Guard Corps as a foreign terrorist organization, an unprecedented step, designating a state's military as a terrorist organization. After years of pushback under the Bush administration, the Obama administration, Trump finally greenlit it and designated the group as a terrorist organization. After that happened, calls started to come from the neocon think tanks in Washington, and even Mike Pompeo himself inferred or acknowledged that, yes, we would potentially target Soleimani because he's a terrorist and we would treat him like al-Baghdadi of ISIS. So while this came as a surprise, and I think nobody thought that the United States and the Trump administration would have the gall to actually go forward with this and deal with the implications, it doesn't come out of nowhere. There was a campaign behind this. Okay,
fair enough. So we've discussed this sort of the possible rationales for this, and obviously these possible rationales on this assassination of Soleimani could range from I guess. I don't know why Donald Trump would have an agenda of this sorts. I mean, of a guy he didn't even know who existed really 2 or 3 years prior, and there's clearly people who don't want a deal to be made. It's not clear to me that Donald Trump didn't want to make a deal, but again, it's very hard to get into his head. So let's try something that is equally as challenging. Having established that might be hard. What are the pressures on the Iranian leadership now, and what might they do to retaliate? Because this seems to me to be like this is the way that it would go, right? They're going to retaliate, and the question is the nature of the retaliation, how the U.S. reacts to that retaliation, is a function of what the retaliation is, and I guess how much the U.S. Feels, the Trump administration feels they need to escalate or to maintain their I guess, manhood, their dominance. I mean, honestly, there's a quality of this. It feels like, some middle-aged guy getting a Corvette. But there was one thing I saw earlier today was the spokesman for the Iranian Parliament's Committee on National Security put out this statement, quote, "Vengeance for the assassination of General Soleimani does not require a regional war, and the United States will pay a heavy price for committing this crime." Well, give me a sense of what that means, if it means anything, that is from which we can divine what the Iranians might do to respond, and what is on the table in terms of their response, do you think?
So there's certainly the possibility of attacks on U.S. service members, on interests and assets of U.S. allies like Saudi Arabia and Israel. If there is sort of another gear towards the Iranian escalation, which I think there certainly is, I think Iran has been relatively restrained in how it has responded to the maximum pressure campaign. Iran took some pretty provocative moves, such as targeting the Saudi oil facility, but always with plausible deniability and always sort of with a mind of, not allowing this to cross a line that could trigger a escalation towards war. And I think that now the leash has been taken off. Now, we'll see how sort of strategic the Iranians want to be about this, or if there's, if sort of the more aggressive hardline forces in Iran have enough say that they actually encourage, outright encouragement of attacks on U.S. personnel or otherwise. So that's certainly, I think the first thing that people will point to, and then
let me just stop you there for a second. Just will you explain the dynamic of like what and I think this may be more of a generic statecraft question, but the value of deniability or plausible deniability, at least. Because that the U.S. could have said we were targeting Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, who was this Iraqi militia leader, and we got lucky in also assassinating Soleimani, and given some wiggle room that the U.S. did not actually target this very popular military figure in Iran. That was almost sort of accidental, and that would have put less pressure on the Iranians. Correct? Expand on that dynamic. Like how that works also for the Iranians. Like, what's the point there of that?
Yeah, well, that certainly wouldn't be very manly if that's what Donald Trump went out and said publicly. I think there's a little bit of a ego issue there, but this has actually been pointed out with the strikes by the U.S. That triggered the embassy protests, and the fact that some analysts said Israel has been striking these Iran-linked militias for some time, but not talking about it publicly, and essentially providing Iran a face-saving way to not retaliate, so that Israel could. And I don't want to necessarily celebrate that whole situation, but that's the thinking there, that Israel was able to sort of project this military power, but not invite a full-scale escalation. And the U.S. I think that the issue here is that the folks who are making these decisions really do believe in peace through strength, and the only thing the Iranians understand is force, and you got to punch them in the mouth and then brag about it in order to cow them from retaliating, and just kind of continually failing to understand that doesn't work, especially not with Iran. Iran, is going to retaliate. This is a government that is is being squeezed right now. It does not have a lot to lose, but one of the key things that it could lose is if there's a sense that it is surrendering to the United States, and I think that would be very bad for the government. But so this plausible deniability, such as with the strike on the Saudi oil facility, that really is, that's cover to not allow this to escalate out of control. And for the United States, Pompeo and others claim that they had evidence that Iran launched those strikes, but nobody ever really saw the evidence, didn't really add up, and so there wasn't a lot of basis for a reprisal, at least not a public one. Now, apparently the U.S. did launch some cyber attacks inside of Iran, and that did get leaked, but I don't think it was necessarily something that they bragged about, and so it didn't necessarily trigger a retaliation.
Well, I mean, so now we have this situation where, I don't understand, what the Trump administration thinks they can get out of this, because, like I say, most people did not know that this was a public enemy number one, Soleimani. Nobody had heard the guy's name. Obviously you had, and I had in passing, but for people who, your average American certainly has not been, there's been no build up to this. It seems to me that, a retaliation at this point is going to look like the first volley. I don't even think that most of the American public had been aware of what happened in Baghdad in terms of the embassy. So where does this go? Are we just simply waiting now to see the size or the nature of the retaliation? And if it's one that the Iranians can basically satiate their domestic, appetite, and at the same time not force the hand of a very fragile ego in Donald Trump?
Well, the entire Trump-Iran strategy, if you can call it that, there was no real end goal. There was Iran was being sanctioned even though it has been upholding its commitments under the nuclear deal. So it's getting punished for keeping to its word. And the rationale was supposedly, the U.S. is going to beat up Iran so bad that Iran's going to come to the negotiating table hat in hand to give the U.S. whatever they wanted, right up to the brink of just changing the entire regime. I don't think anybody seriously believed that was a possibility. So this has always been kind of a dead-end strategy. I think, I don't know that the U.S. has prepared for what's next. I don't know if there's an idea of what to do other than just maximum pressure, just turn the screws as much as possible on Iran. And I think to some extent the Trump administration kind of believes its own propaganda that, Iran, the government's on the brink of collapse, and that there's, the possibility of a failed state, an imminent failed state there, and something like this could actually assassinating Soleimani was actually something that a Saudi general actually proposed to an intermediary with the Trump transition team as part of a plan to destabilize Iran and destabilize the regime. So this has been something that has been discussed in the past. But for Iran, I guess it's a wait-and-see approach for the United States, but Iran has other areas where it could escalate. I mean, on one hand, Iran still, to some extent, has the buy-in of the international community and of Europe when it comes to the nuclear deal. Everybody's trying to save this deal other than the United States. So they're going to ratchet up their nuclear program. They already had plans to take some steps on January 6th to do that, and they may take it to a level that had previously not been foreseen that could really pose the threat of them becoming a, undetectable nuclear weapons state or something along those lines. Or they could, try to work the international community to try to get some resolution through, internationally sanctioned means, although I think that that's probably a pretty remote possibility. But yeah, I think we're all waiting and seeing, and that includes the Trump administration.
Jamal Abdi, President, National Iranian American Council, thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you, Sam.